Eleanor Thompson had always regarded her acreage as her personal haven. Situated miles away from the city's clamor, the sprawling 20-acre estate had served as her sanctuary from the tumult of everyday life. 15 years prior, she had invested her entire savings into this picturesque expanse of gentle hills and lush forests. For Eleanor, the land was far more than just a residence. It was a manifestation of her self-reliance and a tribute to the countless years she had dedicated to building a life on her own terms. Over the years, Eleanor had constructed a modest yet functional home, a separate workshop where she meticulously restored vintage furniture, and a thriving garden where she cultivated her own vegetables. Every element of her property bore the unmistakable imprint of her dedication and nurturing care. One crisp morning, as Eleanor prepared her first cup of tea, she observed something peculiar through her kitchen window. A series of bright orange banners fluttered in the breeze, meandering across her land in a zigzag pattern. With a concerned expression, she set her teacup aside and ventured outside. The early sunlight streamed through the trees, casting elongated shadows across the ground as she followed the trail of banners. She was certain these banners hadn't been there the previous day. Her property was remote, accessible only via a private gravel path secured by a locked gate. As she proceeded further onto her land, the banners guided her to a sight that filled her with unease. A trench had been carved through her meadow, slicing into the earth like a gaping fissure. Vibrant yellow pipes lay exposed, winding through the bare soil, their glossy surfaces gleaming under the sun. Heavy machinery stood abandoned nearby, their tires leaving deep grooves in the earth. Eleanor's pulse quickened. No one had sought her permission, nor had there been any prior notification. Her initial thought was that this must be an error. Perhaps the contractors had mistaken her property for another, she mused. But as she scrutinized the area, a sign affixed beside the trench drew her attention. The inscription read, "Community Safety Initiative. Authorized gas line installation," in bold letters, accompanied by the emblem of the local homeowners association. Eleanor stared at the sign, her confusion morphing into indignation. Her land was explicitly excluded from the association's jurisdiction. When Eleanor had purchased the property, she had ensured it remained outside the homeowners association's domain, a detail she had confirmed repeatedly. She had no obligation to pay association fees, adhere to their regulations, or answer to their board. Legally, her land was unequivocally hers, yet here was indisputable proof that they had trespassed, excavating her property without her consent. Resolute in seeking answers, Eleanor returned to her home, retrieved her phone, and dialed the HOA office. After enduring several minutes of silence, a disinterested receptionist finally answered, "HOA office, how may I assist you?" Eleanor's voice was strained with controlled frustration. "This is Eleanor Thompson. There's construction on my land that I didn't authorize. I need to know who's responsible." The receptionist clicked her tongue, evidently viewing the call as an inconvenience. "Let me check the file. What's your address?" Eleanor provided it, pacing her living room as she awaited a response. Moments later, the receptionist responded, "Ah, yes, that's part of the safety improvement project. Gas lines are being installed across several properties in the area to modernize infrastructure and ensure safety compliance." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "My property isn't part of the HOA. You have no right to be here, let alone dig trenches and lay pipes." "Who approved this?" "According to our records, the landowner's signature was obtained for this project," the receptionist replied nonchalantly. "That's impossible," Eleanor retorted sharply. "I never signed anything." There was a brief silence before the receptionist suggested, "If you have an issue, I recommend contacting the HOA president, Gregory Langford. I can transfer you to his office." Eleanor agreed, but after enduring several minutes on hold, the call abruptly ended. Incensed, she grabbed her car keys and made her way to the HOA office in town. The building was unassuming, a small gray structure nestled between a dry cleaner and a nail salon. Inside, the faint aroma of stale coffee lingered in the air. At the front desk, the receptionist barely acknowledged her as she demanded to see Langford. "Do you have an appointment?" she inquired, tapping her nails on the counter. "No, but I'm not leaving until I speak to him," Eleanor insisted firmly. With a resigned sigh, the receptionist made a phone call to someone in the back. A few minutes later, a tall man in a well-fitted suit entered the office. His demeanor exuded a polished politeness. "Miss Thompson, I'm Gregory Langford. How can I assist you?" Eleanor didn't mince words. "I need to know why you're excavating my property without my permission." Langford's smile remained unwavering. The gas line project. It's part of our initiative to enhance safety and reliability within the community. Rest assured, it's for everyone's benefit." "My property isn't part of the HOA," Eleanor stated firmly. "You have no authority here." Langford tilted his head thoughtfully. "According to our updated records, it is. The jurisdiction was expanded 2 years ago to include adjacent properties for projects like this. We have your signature on file." Eleanor's anger surged. "You forged it." Langford's smile stiffened. "Those are serious allegations, Miss Thompson. If you wish to dispute this, I suggest taking it up through the proper channels. However, the project will proceed as planned." Eleanor clenched her fists. "You're trespassing, and I'll involve the authorities." Langford's expression turned icy. "You're welcome to try, but I advise caution before obstructing the project. It's for the community's safety, after all." Feeling the weight of his threat, Eleanor left the office, her mind ablaze with questions and fury. Determined to confront the HOA, she returned home, her resolve hardening. As she drove back, her grip on the steering wheel tightened with each mile. How could the HOA assert jurisdiction over her land when it had been clearly excluded? And who had forged her signature? The audacity of their actions infuriated her. Upon reaching her driveway, Eleanor's anger transformed into steely determination. She wasn't about to let this injustice go unanswered. Parking her vehicle in front of her house, she grabbed a flashlight and made her way back to the site of the trench. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the field. The machinery and pipes remained untouched since earlier, but the scene felt increasingly ominous in the dimming light. Eleanor walked along the length of the trench, inspecting the exposed pipes and the scattered piles of earth. It was then she noticed an envelope, partially buried near one of the orange banners. She knelt and retrieved the envelope, brushing off the dirt. It bore the HOA's logo and was addressed to the property owner. Inside, Eleanor found a copy of the purported signed authorization for the project. The signature was crude and uneven, a blatant forgery to anyone familiar with her handwriting. Additionally, the document was a generic notice outlining the supposed benefits of the gas line installation: enhanced property values, improved safety, and compliance with modern standards. Eleanor clenched her jaw as she read the notice. It was all corporate jargon, intended to make homeowners feel compelled to comply. But Eleanor knew better. This was not about safety or modernization. It was about control. She tucked the envelope into her pocket and returned home, spreading the contents on her dining table. She photographed the forged document and the notice, then retrieved the original deed to her property. The deed was unequivocal. Her land was explicitly excluded from the HOA's jurisdiction, a primary reason she had purchased the property. The idea of being beholden to a homeowners association had never appealed to her, and she had paid a premium to secure her independence. Yet here they were, arrogantly claiming ownership over something that rightfully belonged to her. That night, sleep eluded Eleanor. She sat in her living room with the lights off, gazing out the window toward the field where the trench marred her land. She felt vulnerable, as if an intruder could invade at any moment to further desecrate her property. This was not merely about installing a gas line. It was a power play, a tactic to intimidate her into submission. By morning, Eleanor had formulated a plan. She contacted her attorney, Margaret Collins, a seasoned and pragmatic lawyer she had worked with years ago during a property dispute. After explaining the situation and emailing her the photos of the forged documents, Eleanor awaited Margaret's response. An hour later, Margaret called back with a grave tone. Eleanor, this is serious. The forged signature alone is grounds for legal action, and their claim of jurisdiction over your property exacerbates the issue. We need to act swiftly before they can inflict more damage, Margaret advised. I'll file a cease and desist order against the HOA to halt construction immediately, but be prepared, it may escalate. Organizations like this don't easily back down, especially once they've invested time and resources into a project. Eleanor nodded, despite Margaret not being able to see her. Do whatever it takes. I won't let them overpower me. After ending the call, Eleanor felt a flicker of relief. At least she had professional support. However, as hours passed, her unease grew. The cease and desist order wouldn't be filed until the next day, and she had no assurance the construction crew wouldn't return in the meantime. That evening, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She drove into town and purchased several heavy-duty padlocks and chains. Returning home, Eleanor secured the gate at her property's entrance, tightly wrapping the chain around the metal bars and double-locking it. If anyone attempted to access her land, they would first have to breach the gate. Yet, despite the added security, Eleanor couldn't dispel the feeling that the HOA would remain undeterred. Her suspicions were confirmed the following morning when she heard the rumble of engines approaching. Peering out the window, she saw a convoy of trucks parked just outside her gate. Several men in reflective vests and hard hats stood near the vehicles, conversing among themselves. One of them approached the gate and shook it, testing the chain. Eleanor grabbed her phone and stepped outside, stopping a few feet from the entrance. "This is private property," she called out firmly. "You're trespassing." The man who had tested the gate stepped forward, clipboard in hand. "We're here on behalf of the HOA to continue the gas line installation," he stated. "You need to remove this gate immediately, or we'll involve law enforcement." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "You've already broken the law by trespassing and forging my signature. If anyone is calling law enforcement, it's me." The man remained unfazed. "We have all the necessary permits to be here. The project has been approved and your signature is on file." Eleanor's frustration boiled over. "That signature is forged," she countered. "I have documents to prove it." The man glanced at his colleagues before returning his attention to Eleanor. "I'm just doing my job. If you have an issue, address it with the HOA." Before Eleanor could respond, one of the trucks began to back toward the gate, seemingly preparing to ram it. She stepped closer, her voice steady yet authoritative. "If you damage my property, you'll be held accountable. I'm warning you." The driver hesitated, and the man with the clipboard raised a hand to signal him to stop. "We'll be back," he declared coldly. "This isn't over." Eleanor watched as the trucks turned and drove away, leaving behind clouds of dust. Her hands trembled with adrenaline as she called Margaret again. "They just showed up at my gate. They were ready to force their way in." Margaret sighed on the other end. "That's exactly the kind of intimidation tactic I anticipated. I'll expedite the cease and desist order and file a report about this incident. But be cautious. They aren't playing by the rules." Margaret's words echoed in Eleanor's mind long after the call ended. That night, Eleanor sat in her workshop, surrounded by the tools and furniture that had always provided her solace. Yet even here, she felt the weight of the ongoing conflict. This wasn't merely a dispute over her property. It was a battle to protect the life she had meticulously built. Eleanor knew the worst was yet to come. The following morning, still tense from the previous day's events, she couldn't shake the image of the trucks lined up outside her gate or the cold assurance in the foreman's voice when he declared, "This isn't over." The atmosphere around her property felt heavy, as if an invisible line of conflict had been drawn for the first time in years. Her sanctuary now felt under siege, and Eleanor understood she had to act decisively before the situation spiraled further out of control. The first step was thorough documentation. Grabbing her camera, she spent the morning traversing the length of the trench, capturing images of the exposed pipes, the deep tracks left by the machinery, and the overall damage to her land. Each photograph was a small act of defiance, a way to reclaim control, even if only temporarily. She returned to her workshop and printed each image, compiling them alongside a folder of pertinent documents. Her deed explicitly stating her property's exclusion from HOA jurisdiction, the forged authorization letter she had discovered, and copies of the cease and desist order Margaret had emailed her late the previous night. With her evidence in hand, Eleanor contacted the county recorder's office. The clerk she spoke with was courteous, but reluctant to provide extensive information over the phone. When Eleanor mentioned the forgery and unauthorized construction, the clerk recommended an in-person visit to review any recent changes to her property's records. The mere suggestion sent a chill down Eleanor's spine. If the HOA had forged her signature, they might have tampered with the property records as well. By mid-morning, Eleanor was driving into town, her evidence folder resting on the passenger seat. The county recorder's office was a modest building with outdated furnishings and a faint scent of old paper. Eleanor explained her situation to a middle-aged clerk behind the counter, who listened attentively as she outlined her concerns. The clerk pulled up Eleanor's property file and frowned upon scanning the records. It appears there was an amendment filed about 2 years ago, the clerk observed, adjusting the monitor so Eleanor could view the screen. The display showed a scanned document with the HOA's letterhead. The amendment stated that her property had been incorporated into the HOA's jurisdiction as part of a community safety initiative. At the bottom of the document was a signature purportedly Eleanor's, clumsily forged, mirroring the one on the construction authorization. Eleanor's stomach churned. "That's not my signature," she asserted firmly. The clerk nodded sympathetically. "If that's the case, you'll need to file a formal dispute. We can flag this document for further review, but it may take some time to resolve." "Meanwhile, they're tearing up my land," Eleanor muttered, more to herself than to the clerk. The clerk hesitated before leaning in slightly. "If you don't mind me saying, you're not the first to raise concerns about this HOA. They've been involved in numerous projects lately, and not all have been above board." Eleanor left the office with a mixture of anger and unease. The forged document was another piece of evidence strengthening her case, but it also highlighted the extent to which the HOA was willing to go to assert control. They weren't merely pushing boundaries, they were obliterating them. Upon returning home, Eleanor discovered something that made her heart race. A large piece of machinery had been left parked just outside her gate. Its massive bucket was lowered, ominously close to the chain and padlock she had installed. No one was present, but the message was unmistakable. They were challenging her to escalate the conflict. Eleanor stood there for a moment, her fists clenched, before retreating indoors to call Margaret. Margaret listened patiently as Eleanor detailed the latest developments before letting out a heavy sigh. "They're trying to intimidate you," Margaret stated. "They're betting you'll back down under enough pressure. That's not going to happen." Eleanor responded resolutely. "Good, Margaret, file the cease and desist order and prepare a preliminary lawsuit against the HOA for trespassing, forgery, and property damage. It's aggressive, but they've left us no choice." Without hesitation, Eleanor agreed. After ending the call, she turned her attention to the machinery outside. She wasn't about to let it remain as a symbol of the HOA's dominance over her land. Armed with a wrench and her unwavering determination, Eleanor approached the backhoe and began disabling it. She didn't need to do much, just loosen a few key components to ensure it wouldn't start if they attempted to use it again. Once finished, she stepped back, allowing herself a small, grim smile. If they wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The next day, tensions escalated further. Eleanor was in her workshop when she heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. She stepped outside to see a black sedan pulling up to her gate. 2 men in suits exited the car, their expressions stern and professional. One carried a briefcase. Miss Thompson?" the taller of the two began. "We'd like to have a word." Eleanor crossed her arms defiantly. "If you're here on behalf of the HOA, you can leave. My lawyer will be in touch." The man with the briefcase remained unfazed. "We're here to discuss a potential resolution to this situation." The HOA is prepared to offer you a generous settlement in exchange for your cooperation. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. What kind of settlement? He opened the briefcase and produced a document. In exchange for granting permanent access to your property for the gas line installation, the HOA is willing to compensate you financially. Additionally, we can assist with integrating your land into the community's jurisdiction, which would increase its value. Eleanor felt her blood boil. You want me to sell my independence so you can bulldoze my land and call it progress? Forget it. The man's polite demeanor remained intact, though an edge laced his voice. I'd advise you to reconsider. Fighting this will only complicate matters for you. Remove yourselves from my property, Eleanor demanded firmly. The two men exchanged a glance before retreating to their sedan and driving away. Eleanor felt a cold sense of foreboding. They were no longer merely trying to intimidate her. They were attempting to buy her off. Their failure to do so would likely lead to even more aggressive actions. That evening, Eleanor heard the unmistakable crunch of tires on gravel outside her home. Peering through the window, she saw headlights moving slowly around the perimeter of her property. The vehicle didn't stop, but its presence sent a clear message. They were watching her. Determined to fortify her defenses, Eleanor spent the night reinforcing her property's security. She added extra locks to her gates, installed additional motion sensor lights, and crafted a makeshift alarm system using tripwires and empty cans. It wasn't much, but it provided a semblance of protection against further intrusions. As she finally settled down to rest, the gravity of the situation weighed heavily on her. She wasn't merely fighting for her land. She was battling to preserve her autonomy, her peace, and her right to live on her own terms. No matter the lengths the HOA was willing to go, Eleanor was prepared to endure whatever challenges lay ahead. The following morning, Eleanor awoke with a persistent tension in her chest. Her once tranquil property now resembled a battleground with constant reminders of the HOA's intrusion. The sight of the parked backhoe outside her gate, the forged documents, and the relentless noise from machinery had transformed her sanctuary into a conflict zone. This was no longer just about a gas line. It was about control, and the HOA showed no signs of relenting. After preparing a strong cup of tea, Eleanor reviewed the latest email from Margaret. The cease and desist order had been officially filed, but there was no assurance the HOA would comply. Margaret warned her that legal battles of this nature could extend for months, and even with clear evidence of forgery and trespassing, the HOA might attempt to manipulate the system to stall or further intimidate her. Eleanor realized she couldn't afford to remain passive. She needed additional leverage, something to place her in a position of strength rather than mere defense. With this in mind, she delved deeper into the HOA's activities. Over the years, she had avoided any entanglement with them, but it was now evident that this was not an isolated incident. She suspected they had employed similar tactics against others, emboldened by a lack of accountability. She began her investigation with the forged documents, meticulously analyzing every detail. The signature was undeniably fake, but what caught her attention was the name of the notary public who had supposedly witnessed the document: Karen Holbrook. A swift online search revealed that Holbrook was listed as a member of the HOA board, a blatant conflict of interest. However, Eleanor needed more than just circumstantial evidence. Next, she visited the county building to request copies of recent permits filed by the HOA. Recognizing her from her earlier visit, the clerk handed her a stack of documents with a sympathetic glance. "Good luck," she whispered quietly. "You're not the first person to push back against them, but most don't get very far." Eleanor spent the afternoon poring over the permits, noticing a disturbing pattern. Several properties adjacent to her own had been flagged for infrastructure improvements over the past 2 years, all under the guise of safety projects. In nearly every case, the property owners had either sold their land or had been absorbed into the HOA's jurisdiction shortly afterward. The permits were vague, the work often incomplete, and the final reports filed by the HOA were riddled with inconsistencies. The deeper Eleanor delved, the clearer it became that the gas line project was not merely about utility access. It was part of a broader scheme to force non-HOA properties into compliance, and, in some cases, seize valuable land through intimidation, legal loopholes, or outright forgery. Her property was simply the latest target in this expanding strategy. That evening, Eleanor sat in her workshop surrounded by the evidence she had amassed. Her hands shook with frustration as she pieced together the puzzle. The HOA wasn't just overstepping its authority. It was operating like a predatory corporation, preying on individuals unable to defend themselves. Despite the overwhelming injustice, a flicker of doubt lingered in her mind. What if she couldn't stop them? What if they had already manipulated the system so thoroughly that no amount of evidence could halt their progress? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of tires on gravel. Peering out her window, Eleanor saw a utility truck parked near the trench on her property. Two men in reflective vests climbed out and began inspecting the pipes. Her blood boiled. They were disregarding the cease and desist order entirely. Eleanor grabbed her phone and called Margaret, explaining the situation. "They're working on my property again," she reported, striving to maintain composure. "I'll file a motion for contempt of court," Margaret responded sharply. "They're blatantly violating the order, which will strengthen our case. Just document everything, photos, videos, anything you can." Eleanor hung up and stepped outside, camera in hand. She approached the workers, who barely acknowledged her presence. "You're trespassing," she declared loudly. "I have a cease and desist order, and you're violating it." One of the men glanced at her but continued his work. "We're just following orders," he replied dismissively. "Whose orders?" Eleanor demanded. "Talk to the HOA," the man responded before turning back to the pipe. Eleanor took several photos and videos of the workers, ensuring to capture their equipment in the trench in the background. As she did so, a third figure emerged from the truck, a woman in her late 40s with sharp features and a clipboard in hand. Eleanor recognized her immediately from her research. Karen Holbrook, the notary whose name had appeared on the forged documents. "Miss Thompson," Karen said with a forced smile, approaching her. "I see you're documenting the progress. Transparency is important in projects like these." "Transparency?" Eleanor snapped. "You forged my signature and are trespassing on my land. I'd call that anything but transparent." Karen's smile remained unwavering. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. The HOA has all the necessary permissions to complete this project. If you'd like to discuss the matter further, I suggest setting up a meeting with Mr. Langford." "I'm not interested in your lies or your meetings," Eleanor retorted coldly. "You're violating a court order, and I have the evidence to prove it." Karen's expression hardened. "Be careful, Miss Thompson. Obstructing a public safety project is a serious offense. I'd hate to see this escalate unnecessarily." Without another word, she turned and walked back to the truck. The workers quickly packed up their equipment and drove away, leaving Eleanor seething with anger. Determined not to let the HOA intimidate her further, Eleanor forwarded the photos and videos to Margaret, who assured her they would bolster their motion for contempt. That night, Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was deteriorating. The HOA wasn't backing down. Instead, they seemed to be intensifying their efforts, pushing forward with the project despite the legal obstacles and Karen Holbrook's veiled threats. This only reinforced Eleanor's suspicion that they were willing to go to any lengths to achieve their goals. The next morning, Eleanor awoke to find a new affront awaiting her. A bright orange notice was affixed to her front gate, declaring that her property was in violation of local zoning regulations. The notice alleged that her workshop and garden structures had been constructed without proper permits, ordering her to cease all unauthorized activities or face fines and potential demolition. Eleanor tore the notice from the gate, her hands trembling with rage. This was blatant retaliation. The HOA was attempting to overwhelm her, burying her under a mountain of legal issues until she had no choice but to capitulate. But instead of feeling defeated, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She spent the rest of the day gathering every document related to her property, zoning approvals, workshop construction permits, and more. She also reached out to a few neighbors who had previously dealt with the HOA. Most were reluctant to get involved, But one elderly gentleman, Frank Henderson, agreed to meet with her. Over a cup of coffee, Frank recounted his own ordeal with the HOA, explaining how they had coerced him into selling a portion of his land years ago. "They act like they're untouchable," Frank said bitterly. "And for the most part, they are. But if you've got the will to fight them, they're not as invincible as they seem." Frank's words resonated with Eleanor as she returned home that evening. The HOA might possess resources and influence, but they had severely underestimated her resolve. She wasn't merely going to fight back. She was determined to expose their corruption for all to see, even if it meant risking everything. The ensuing days tested every ounce of Eleanor's determination. The bright orange zoning violation notice was just the beginning. By midweek, another letter arrived in the mail, this one from a law firm representing the HOA. It accused Eleanor of deliberately obstructing a public safety project and demanded $75,000 in damages for delays caused by her cease and desist order. The tone of the letter was smug, almost taunting, as if daring her to retaliate. Eleanor read the letter twice, each word fueling the fire within her. The HOA was escalating their attacks, attempting to overwhelm her with legal threats and financial strain. She immediately contacted Margaret, forwarding the letter. Margaret was unsurprised, but equally incensed. "They're trying to make you crack," she explained. "It's a classic pressure tactic. Bury you under legal weight until you can't see a way out." Eleanor responded resolutely. "Well, it's not going to work." Margaret affirmed, "Because we're filing a counterclaim for harassment and fraudulent misrepresentation. I'm also requesting an emergency hearing to address their blatant violations of the cease and desist order." Eleanor felt a flicker of relief at Margaret's confidence, but it was short-lived. That evening, just as the sun began to set, she heard the unmistakable hum of engines outside her home. She walked to her window and saw a fleet of vehicles, trucks and SUVs, parked along the road near her gate. Workers in reflective vests and suits moved around the site, setting up equipment and floodlights as though preparing for a nighttime operation. They weren't stopping. Eleanor grabbed her phone and marched outside, taking pictures as she approached the gate. One of the workers spotted her and waved her off. "Stay back, ma'am," the man called. "This is an active construction zone." "This is private property," Eleanor shot back. "I have a court order that says you're not supposed to be here." The man shrugged. "We're just following instructions." Eleanor's frustration reached its peak. She climbed onto the gate, holding her phone above her head to capture the full scope of their activities. Workers were hauling equipment toward the trench, and one of the trucks had a massive pipe spool strapped to its bed. Despite her anger, something about the pipe seemed unusual. It was larger, heavier, and reinforced with a metal casing. "What are you really doing here?" Eleanor muttered under her breath. Before she could demand answers, a familiar figure stepped out of one of the SUVs, Gregory Langford, the HOA president. He was dressed more casually this time, in jeans and a button-down shirt, but his smug demeanor remained unchanged. "Miss Thompson," Langford called out, spreading his arms as if greeting an old friend. "Good to see you again." "Get off my land," Eleanor snapped. Langford smiled. "This isn't your land anymore, Eleanor. Not entirely. As of 2 years ago, your property was incorporated into the HOA's jurisdiction, and this project was approved by the board. You're free to contest it in court. But until then, we have every right to proceed." "Every right," Eleanor countered. "You forged my signature and trespassed on private property." "You violated the law in more ways than I can count," Eleanor retorted. Langford's smile didn't falter. "Those are bold accusations. I hope you have the evidence to back them up. In the meantime, I suggest you reconsider your approach. Fighting us won't end well for you." Eleanor stepped closer to the gate, her voice low and steady. "Is that a threat?" "It's advice," Langford replied calmly. "Think about it. This conflict, is it really worth it? You've got a wonderful property here. It would be a shame to see it fall into disrepair because of some stubborn grudge against progress. Without responding, Eleanor turned and walked back toward her house, ignoring the sounds of machinery roaring to life behind her. Once inside, she called Margaret again, recounting the confrontation in detail. "They're escalating because they know we're close to uncovering something," Margaret said. "That pipe you mentioned? Are you sure it wasn't standard gas line material?" "I know what I saw," Eleanor replied. "It was reinforced, industrial grade." Margaret paused thoughtfully. "That doesn't make sense. There's no reason for industrial-grade pipes on a residential project. Unless what?" Eleanor pressed. "Unless the gas line is just a cover for something else," Margaret finished. "We need to find out what they're really doing out there." Eleanor's stomach churned at the thought. If the HOA was hiding something more significant, it would explain their desperate attempts to silence her. But uncovering the truth wouldn't be easy. The next day, Eleanor decided to take a closer look at the trench while the workers were gone. Armed with a crowbar and a flashlight, she climbed down into the open pit and examined the exposed pipe. It was evident that it wasn't the standard PVC material used for residential gas lines. The surface was metallic with a faint sheen, suggesting it was coated to withstand extreme pressure or temperature. She pried open a small access panel on the pipe and discovered something even more troubling: wires running alongside the main conduit. This isn't just a gas line, Eleanor realized. It's outfitted for some kind of data transmission or monitoring system. She snapped pictures of everything, her heart racing. Whatever the HOA was doing, it had nothing to do with proving safety. As she climbed out of the trench, Eleanor noticed a figure standing at the edge of the tree line, observing her. The person wore dark clothing and remained still, even as Eleanor stared directly at them. After a tense moment, the figure turned and vanished into the woods. Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. She wasn't just being intimidated anymore. She was being surveilled. That evening, as she reviewed the photos she'd taken, Margaret called with an update. "I've been digging into the HOA's financials," she reported. "It's not easy, but I found something interesting. They've been receiving substantial payments from a company called Meridian Development. Does that name mean anything to you?" "No, it doesn't," Eleanor responded. "Should it?" Margaret asked. Meridian specializes in acquiring land for industrial projects, pipelines, data centers, and similar ventures. My guess is that the HOA struck a deal with them to run this so-called gas line through your property, using their jurisdictional authority as a cover. Eleanor's fist clenched. "So they're selling me out for a payout." "Exactly," Margaret confirmed. "And if Meridian's involved, this is bigger than just you. They've likely targeted other properties in the area as well." Eleanor leaned back in her chair, the weight of the revelation settling over her. The HOA wasn't merely overstepping its bounds. It was part of a larger, more insidious operation. If she didn't stop them, her land wouldn't just be seized. It would be transformed into something unrecognizable. Despite the daunting nature of the fight, Eleanor knew one thing for certain: she wasn't going to back down. That night, Eleanor remained awake, meticulously reviewing the photos, documents, and mounting evidence against the HOA and Meridian Development. Her hands trembled as she connected the dots: the forged signatures, the industrial-grade pipe with hidden wiring, and the payments from Meridian. This was not just about a gas line. It was a coordinated land grab, and her property was merely the latest piece of the puzzle. The HOA didn't care about her rights or the law. They wanted her land, and they were willing to do whatever it took to acquire it. By morning, Margaret had secured an emergency hearing with the court. The violations of the cease and desist order, combined with the new evidence of fraudulent activity, warranted immediate judicial intervention. However, Eleanor understood that even if the court ruled in her favor, the battle was far from over. Langford and Meridian possessed too much at stake, and they wouldn't relent without a fight. Before heading to court, Eleanor made one final trip to the trench. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something crucial. Armed with her camera and a crowbar, she descended into the pit once more, this time following the pipe toward the edge of her property. She discovered a junction box partially buried in the dirt and pried it open. revealing a cluster of wires and a small control module stamped with a Meridian logo. This isn't just a gas line, Eleanor realized. It's part of an infrastructure system, likely intended for data or energy transmission. This isn't about improving the neighborhood. It's about transforming my land into a hub for Meridian's industrial projects. Eleanor took as many pictures as she could before climbing out of the trench and heading to court. The courthouse was bustling with activity when she arrived. Langford was already present, flanked by a team of lawyers and Karen Holbrook, who avoided making eye contact with Eleanor. Margaret greeted her with a firm handshake, her confidence providing a steadying force amid the chaos. The hearing commenced with Margaret presenting the evidence of the forged signatures and the violations of the cease and desist order. She outlined the timeline of events, demonstrating how the HOA had systematically overstepped its bounds and acted in bad faith. The photos of the industrial pipe and the Meridian branded module were the final pieces of evidence, clearly illustrating the true intent behind the so-called safety project. Langford's lawyers attempted to counter, arguing that the HOA was acting within its jurisdiction and that the gas line was essential for the community's safety. However, their defense crumbled under cross-examination. When Margaret questioned Karen Holbrook about her role as a notary, Karen stumbled over her answers, unable to account for the discrepancies in the documents. Finally, Margaret presented the payments from Meridian Development. The courtroom fell silent as she revealed the financial records showing large sums of money transferred to the HOA shortly before the jurisdictional amendment was filed. "This isn't about safety," Margaret declared, her voice sharp and clear. "This is about profit. The HOA has sold out the rights of its members and non-members alike to benefit a private corporation." Langford shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his confident facade beginning to falter. The real turning point came when Eleanor took the stand. Calm and composed, she recounted months of intimidation, trespassing, and blatant disregard for her property rights. She described the trench, the forged documents, and the industrial-grade pipe that had no place on residential land. "I've worked my entire life to build something of my own," Eleanor stated. "This land is mine. It's not for sale, and it's not a pawn in some corporation's game. The HOA and Meridian thought they could bully me into submission, but I'm standing here today because I refuse to let them win." When the hearing concluded, the judge ruled in Eleanor's favor. The cease and desist order was upheld, and all construction on her property was ordered to cease immediately. Additionally, the court mandated an investigation into the HOA's financial dealings with Meridian Development, citing evidence of fraud and misconduct. Langford left the courtroom with a pallid expression, refusing to meet Eleanor's gaze. However, the victory was bittersweet. As Eleanor stood outside the courthouse with Margaret, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was not the end. The ruling had halted the project, but Meridian was a formidable corporation with deep pockets and influential allies. The fight was far from over, and Eleanor knew she needed to remain vigilant. "You did well today," Margaret said, placing a reassuring hand on Eleanor's shoulder. "This is a significant win. You should be proud." Eleanor nodded, though the weight of the ongoing battle still pressed heavily on her. "I'm not done yet," she replied quietly. "Not until they're held accountable for everything they've done. Not just to me, but to everyone they've oppressed along the way." As she drove back to her property, Eleanor felt a renewed sense of purpose. The trench remained, a scar across her land, but it was not permanent. She would rebuild, as she always had, and no matter how long it took, she would ensure that neither Langford nor Meridian ever set foot on her land again. In the weeks following the court's ruling, Eleanor's victory reverberated throughout the community. The investigation into the HOA and Meridian Development was in full swing. Local authorities, emboldened by the court's findings, began scrutinizing the HOA's financial records, uncovering a tangled web of fraudulent transactions, forged documents, and unethical land deals spanning years. For Eleanor, however, the aftermath was far from triumphant. Her land remained scarred by the trench, and the remnants of the industrial pipe served as a constant reminder of how close she had come to losing everything. While the court had ruled in her favor, the damage inflicted on her property and her sense of security was something no judge could repair. The first step toward rebuilding commenced when a team of contractors arrived to remove the pipe and fill the trench. The court had ordered the HOA and Meridian to cover all costs of restoring Eleanor's land. Although the work was a step in the right direction, it didn't erase the frustration she felt watching strangers dismantle what had once been her sanctuary. As the restoration progressed, Eleanor focused on reclaiming the pieces of her life disrupted by the conflict. Her furniture restoration business, which had taken a back seat during the months of legal battles, began to regain momentum. Orders from loyal customers started to flow in again, and the familiar rhythm of sanding, staining, and polishing provided her with a sense of normalcy she hadn't felt in months. Meanwhile, the investigation into the HOA reached its climax. Langford and Holbrook were both charged with fraud and conspiracy, their previously confident exteriors crumbling under the weight of the evidence Margaret had helped uncover. Meridian Development, for its part, distanced itself from the HOA, claiming ignorance of the association's illegal activities. However, internal emails leaked during the investigation painted a different picture, revealing that Meridian had not only been aware of the HOA's tactics but had actively encouraged them. Eleanor followed the developments with a mix of satisfaction and exhaustion. She had won her battle, but it was clear that the war against entities like Meridian wasn't one she could fight alone. Still, her determination to protect her land and her principles remained unshaken. One afternoon, as the contractors finished filling the last section of the trench, Eleanor stood by the edge of her property, watching sunlight filter through the trees. The scars on her land were healing, and for the first time in months, she felt a sense of peace returning. Margaret called her later that evening with an update. "Langford has taken a plea deal," she reported. "He's agreed to testify against Meridian in exchange for a reduced sentence." Eleanor exhaled slowly. "So it's not over yet?" "No," Margaret replied. "But you've done more than enough. The legal system will handle the rest." Eleanor nodded, though the weight of the fight still lingered. "Thank you, Margaret, for everything." "You've shown incredible resilience," Margaret said warmly. "Not everyone would have seen this through to the end." After hanging up, Eleanor walked out to her porch and settled into her favorite chair. The land stretched before her, quiet and serene, as if it too was finally able to breathe again. She knew the fight had changed her, testing her patience, strength, and resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. But it had also reaffirmed her belief that some things are worth fighting for, no matter the cost. In the ensuing weeks, neighbors began reaching out to Eleanor, inspired by her story. Some sought her advice on handling their own HOA conflicts, while others simply wanted to express their gratitude for her stand against a system that had long oppressed them. Eleanor found herself becoming an advocate, sharing her experiences and helping others navigate the tangled web of bureaucracy and corporate greed. One evening, as she locked up her workshop, Eleanor looked out across her property and felt a deep sense of pride she hadn't experienced in a long time. Her land was not just a place to live, it was a symbol of everything she had fought to protect. Though the scars of the battle remained, they stood as a testament to her resilience, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming odds, she had refused to give up. As the sun set over the rolling hills, casting a warm glow across her restored land, Eleanor smiled for the first time in months. Her sanctuary was hers once more, and no one would ever take it from her.